our meeting will begin with a public comment, followed by a work session on middle housing code amendments. There are several housekeeping announcements and instructions related to the meeting format I need to take care of first. Thank you for your patience while I work my way through them. Anyone wishing to access the meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website, the broadcast on channel 21, or by following the access instructions listed on the agenda for this meeting. For those who join the meeting via computer, device, or phone, your microphone, webcam, and phone are automatically muted when you enter the meeting as an attendee. If you wish to participate during the public comment portion of the meeting and haven't done so already, please raise your virtual hand now. Uh-oh, lost my track here. There it is. And it will join the speakers queue in one of two ways. For those of you viewing the meeting on a computer, laptop, or other device, click once on the hand icon. For those listening to the meeting on a phone, press *9. When public comment begins, our meeting moderator will announce the next two speakers at a time. When it's your turn, the moderator will announce your name and unmute your microphone. We have a very short amount of time today for public comment, only 10 minutes, so your time to speak will be based on the number of people signed up to speak. Finally, I want to thank everyone again for their patience, flexibility, and good humor as we work within this new virtual meeting format. As always, feel free to contact staff if there's testimony you were not able to provide or wish to get to us in a different manner. Public comment. Public comment is an opportunity for individuals to speak to the Planning Commission on any topic except for items scheduled for public hearing or public hearing items for which the hearing is already closed. We have, as I noticed, we reserved a small amount of time today, and your hand must be raised in the queue for public comment. When it's your turn, your microphone has been unmuted. Please state your name clearly before beginning your comments. Staff will let you know when your time is up. When your time is concluded, the moderator will mute your microphone. Do we have anyone who wishes to speak today? We do not. It does not appear that we do. So we can now move on to the main item of our agenda, which is middle housing code amendment updates. And that item will be handled most ably by Terry Harding. Terry, thank you. Take it away.
Can you all hear me now? Sorry about that. Sorry about that. I was just talking away. Welcome, commissioners. We have a very exciting meeting today, several guests, and then a good chunk of time. You all agreed to extend your meeting to go through the code recommendations and take straw polls. So I'm going to go over briefly our agenda. First, we're going to hear from Dr. Sarah Adams-Shane about exclusionary zoning, and she has a presentation prepared for us. Then we'll come back and reshuffle things a little bit. So just to let you know what the rest of the meeting looks like, we have some speakers coming at around 12:15 to report on their experience serving on a roundtable or focus group. And then we'll begin the code recommendations straw polls at 12:45. And I'll go into some more detail about that before we start. I also scheduled this for a 5-minute break because I can't sit down for 3 hours without stretching, and I thought that might be a good idea. And I think at least one person needs to leave at 1:30, and then we'll come back and finish up. Tiffany, did you want to have a question about the agenda?
No, thanks, Carrie. I just wanted to let you know that I've actually changed some things around my schedule, so I have someone covering for me in that board meeting. So.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's
yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. Awesome. Okay. As an introduction to Sarah's presentation, I just want to ground you all in the Middle Housing Project goals. Number one, we are aiming to comply with the House Bill 2001. In so doing, we also have a goal of furthering equity and long-term affordability in Eugene, and enabling housing availability and diversity of types. So those have been consistent throughout our work on this project. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Sarah, and please bear with us while we change who's sharing their screen. There we go.
All right. I just wanted to check that you could see my PowerPoint. Yes, wonderful. Great. Well, thank you. I just wanted to start by thanking Chair Ramey, the commissioners, and the staff, for inviting me and then being here to hear this presentation that I'm going to give, and also others on the meeting, including members of the public. And so I'm going to talk primarily about land use law and zoning in particular, and what I've called here housing justice. We talk about environmental justice, climate justice, and in many ways, what I'm really talking about is injustice. But then the reforms that we're undertaking and that we still can undertake to move toward justice. And I wanted to start with saying thank you and giving a little bit more information about myself. And normally we see these thank you slides at the end, but I want to say another thank you. And it isn't just a thank you for being here and for inviting me, but a thank you for allowing me to talk to you about such a traumatic and ongoing trauma-causing systemic problem, in terms of systemic racism and other harms caused by the segregationist nature of many of our land use laws. And this isn't just in Eugene, but in cities throughout the country. And one thing that I find is important to do when we're having these conversations is to acknowledge that it's a trauma-inducing subject that I'm going to be talking about, because I'm talking about, racial oppression and other oppressions, and the research, and also just my personal experience, and the experiences that have been shared with me show that it causes trauma to really listen and engage in these kinds of conversations. Or it triggers trauma, I should say. And you might say, well, why would we do that? I've had relatives ask me that. Well, why do you even focus on this if it's so trauma-inducing? And I like to reference the words of Resmaa Menakem, who talks about clean pain and dirty pain. And I think that it's a clean pain when we dive in and we do the work to make things better, and a dirty pain when we stick our heads in the sand and ignore it. So there's that. That's why I'm going to say it's worth it, even if it's trauma-inducing. But because it's trauma-inducing, and of course the trauma differs, based on our own personal experiences, I want to encourage anyone listening to this to do a little bit of self-reflection. So if you're in a situation where you can turn off your video, that might be something that you want to do. Trauma, the research is really showing now that trauma is held in the body, and it's a very physical experience. So I encourage, when I'm talking to my students or giving presentations, for people who, to potentially turn off their camera and close their eyes for a moment and just check in on, where am I feeling this? And do I feel right? Does it feel better to keep my camera off? Or not? Are there things I can modify in how I sit through this, so that I'm taking care of my own well-being? And I'll stop with that. But I'm happy to talk about this information, and also the concept of trauma-informed teaching with anyone who's interested. And so here's my contact information. I also have it on the last slide as well, so I'll show it again. And this is what I'm planning to talk about this morning. Terry, I wanted to check in with you on the timing.
We have you inclusive of Q&A going until 12:15.
Okay, thank you. So we'll see. This might be ambitious, but this is what I want to talk about this morning. I want to talk about the segregationist history of zoning. And when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about having the express purpose of segregating people by race. And then, later in zoning's history, including into the present, the continued covert regulation of land users. So those of us who are really familiar with land use law know that land use law can legitimately and validly regulate land uses, but it's not supposed to regulate land users. Okay, we're not supposed to be creating districts where certain kinds of people can live here and there, but essentially we do. And then, the economic, really the myriad, right, the injustices that result from that early segregationist history, and also from the continuing more covert segregationist outcomes. And so lots of injustices. I named a few on the slide, economic, education, public health, environmental, and climate. I'm not going to talk about all of those, but I'll touch on them. And then reform. I think that's what we really want to know about, and I know that's the work that you're doing right now. So, but a bit about the segregationist history. I don't know why number 2 isn't showing up here. Let's see, there it is. So just kind of to some of what I could touch on if I was touching on segregationist history is the early use of express racial zoning, later found by the US Supreme Court to be unconstitutional. A little bit later in the history of zoning and land use law, the widespread use of racially restrictive covenants, in the era of around the 1940s, federal mortgage programs that were expressly promoting homeownership for white families and expressly creating barriers to homeownership for families of color. And I want to be really clear that I'm using that word express because it requires no reading between the lines, right? So I'm talking about early express racially segregationist history. And then urban renewal and displacement, forced dislocation. Some of that was expressly race-based. Some of it later was more covert. So just a little bit about the use of express racial zoning. So, really early, in the history of this country, in 1876, California and San Francisco were using not comprehensive zoning ordinances like we think about today, but local land use laws to segregate Chinese Americans and Chinese immigrants and other Asians, but principally they were targeting Chinese at the time. And we think more when we think about express racial zoning of zoning ordinances that called out and segregated Black and white families and individuals. And those arose and were really, first we saw that in Baltimore in 1910, and then those became somewhat widespread by 1916 with, I've just listed the cities here and I'm not going to name all of them, but Baltimore, Winston-Salem, much more widespread and common in the South, these express racial zoning ordinances. And here's just an example of the kind of language. So it says, an ordinance to prevent conflict and ill feeling between the white and colored races in the city of Louisville, and to preserve the public peace and promote the general welfare by making reasonable provisions requiring, as far as practicable, the use of separate blocks for residences, places of abode, and places of assembly by white and colored respectively. So that's the actual language from one of these ordinances, and they were pretty wide. This language was copied and somewhat widespread amongst those cities that I listed on the last slide. And I just wanted to point out that, just like now, when we see the use of legal tools that are, sorry for this. When we see the use of legal tools now that have the effect of benefiting, for example, white people and burdening people of color, now too, we see language around those tools that describes them as, for the public good. And we saw that language at this time too, right? To prevent conflict and ill feeling. So I always encourage to, really, when we see that disparate benefit and burden, to really contemplate if there really is a public good that needs to be achieved here, can we achieve it in a way that doesn't have the disparate benefit and burden, right? So identify that public good and find ways to achieve it without that disparate benefit and burden. So along comes a US Supreme Court case in 1917 that rules that these kinds of express racial ordinances are unconstitutional. It's actually ruling that they're an unconstitutional limit on your ability to sell property. And so I would just like to flag, like, how did the country receive that? What were academics and, politicians and, newspaper reporters saying about this US Supreme Court case that ruled that these racial ordinances were unconstitutional? And at the time, so that the highlighted portion on the slide, at the time, what we were seeing were academic articles, for example, and other articles that were, saying, no, these racial zoning ordinances are necessary for the public good. So here's just another example of that, right? Whether other objections may be urged against them, it cannot truly be said that there is any discrimination in the ordinances against the colored race. And it goes on to talk about how they're treating, these ordinances are treating the races equally. So it's a separate but equal kind of approach. And of course, we know that they're incredibly discriminatory. So here again, I say it's like, it's a lesson looking back at the past of how are we justifying our use of tools that discriminate. And also the timing of the kind of thinking that we were seeing in 1917 around the time of the Buchanan case, but also thinking about the timing of when zoning ordinances were adopted in the city, right? City of Eugene. This slide refers to Portland, just because I could find imagery for Portland, and it's harder to find the imagery for Eugene. But around the time that the zoning ordinances were adopted, the United States generally, at least the politically powerful within the United States, were embracing a segregationist movement, a racially segregationist movement. And they were embracing all the way up to the US Supreme Court, a separate but equal doctrine that has since been, found to be itself discriminatory. So when we're looking back at whether or not the first zoning ordinances adopted in cities, for example, in Oregon, and asking whether there was a racially discriminatory intent behind these zoning ordinances, I think it's important to think about what was on the rise at that time in this country. And one thing that was definitely on the rise within the United States around the early 1920s, when our zoning ordinances in Oregon were being adopted, was a close alliance between politicians in power and the Ku Klux Klan, and really this pervasive white racial segregationist approach. So this is an example from a racially restrictive covenant. I don't want to read the whole thing, but this would be a private private agreement that restricts who can own or reside in housing. And I looked at my own the title to my own house. I live in Eugene, Oregon, and look through the title history, and I have there's a racially restrictive racially restrictive covenant in my own home and in the whole subdivision that I live in that was built in the 1960s. So right, so nor shall the same or any part thereof in any manner used or occupied by Chinese, Japanese, Negroes, etc. So we see when we look back into these documents the restriction in the title of our own homes, or homes that others might be interested in buying or living in. these are no longer valid or enforceable, but they're still there. And I mentioned before these New Deal era programs, that were for whites only. And also, I'm referencing here the redlining history. This slide shows the city of Berkeley. I could pull up a slide for Portland too. I don't know if you can easily pull up any redlining slides for Eugene, but I just happen to have this Berkeley one handy. This one I think is quite helpful because it actually compares redlining. So redlining, for anyone who's not familiar with that, right, was a appraiser. Redlining was the practice of identifying high risk to low risk areas with respect to mortgage lending, and identifying an area as high risk for mortgage lending based on the existence of Black or other people of color in the neighborhood, or even of white people in a neighborhood who were deemed likely to rent or sell to Black or people of color. And so what Berkeley has done is Berkeley has analyzed the redlining map, right, from the New Deal era against its current zoning, and for the purposes of seeing where multifamily housing is, and noting that multifamily housing tends to be clustered around areas that were deemed high hazard or hazardous under old redlining. So, and I also mentioned displacement and forced relocation. So this is the Albina neighborhood in Portland, which was a thriving neighborhood in the early 1960s, a thriving Black neighborhood. And then, as a result of urban renewal projects, here we have the freeway, right, cutting a huge swath right through the Albina neighborhood, and also a massive area here that's was for Emmanuel Hospital and for the Coliseum, which completely decimated this neighborhood, and is just an example of things we saw all over the country, including in Eugene. So this picture, I believe this picture is the Ferry Street Bridge neighborhood. I really struggled to find a historic picture of the Ferry Street Bridge neighborhood. So apologies if this is actually not. But that's the Ferry Street Bridge neighborhood, as I'm sure that many on the meeting know, was the first Black community in the Eugene area, and is and has been referred to as a tent city, as if the structures were all tents, but that's not accurate. There were houses and I believe a school. I'm sure there's people on the meeting who know even more about this history than I do. I'm from Oregon, but I have been out of state teaching at other universities for a while, and so I'm not, and I'm new to living in Eugene. And so Eugene had this Ferry Street Bridge neighborhood. It was outside the municipal limits of Eugene. It wasn't served by the city's public services. And it was this, Black community. And at some point in the history of Eugene, Eugene wanted to annex it, and did, in fact, and bulldozed that community and displaced those residents. And I learned a lot about this on the city's own website, because the city provides this information now. And what I wanted to highlight here is kind of this process that occurs of displacement and then relocation to areas that are, that what you find are housing in close proximity to other undesirable land uses. And so in this particular case, I was just kind of highlighting, what we see often is this clustering of multifamily, although not always multifamily, but multifamily with other uses like heavy industrial uses, and then, resulting really, horrible environmental justice outcomes, as this slide shows here for this one zip code, right? 97402. And it's percent of total emissions, air emissions of, 99.9%, 100%, or, 99.9%. And as compared to almost none of these particular pollutants in the rest of Eugene. And so, and this has been the subject of ongoing environmental, justice and claims. So I just wanted to highlight that as I talk about, the effects, right? So, something more current, even, really, I think right in all of our memories is thinking back to just last fall with the fires and the smoke pollution that, the air pollution that we experienced as part of the fires. I mean, I actually study and do a lot of writing on climate and climate mitigation and climate adaptation. And I've done a ton of work on flooding. And, as I experienced, and as many on the call who are probably here in Eugene experienced, more than a week of air that really couldn't or shouldn't have been breathed, right? So much smoke in our air that plants were, that the temperature dropped 20 degrees just because the sun was blocked. And so this slide is just really horrific data. So this slide is looking at, right, so United States West Coast wildfires as of October 13th, 2020. And these graphs right here are showing estimated elderly excess deaths per million people. And so we don't have Eugene on here, but we have Portland. And, at least from my own personal experience, I think that the air was worse in Eugene. Right, so this study estimates that every additional microgram per cubic meter of daily PM 2.5 exposure causes, 0.69 additional deaths per million people aged 65 or older. And what we're really just seeing here is a vulnerable group, right? People 65 and older. But I also think about during the wildfires last year, who didn't have air conditioning or a means of filtering their air? Who was still going outside to work? And then thinking back to the last slide, and neighborhoods that are already, having, significantly higher asthma rates, and thinking about this layering effect of environmental harm, and the work that Oregon's doing right now with respect to climate justice and housing equity. So coming back to this question of clustering multifamily and undesirable land uses. So one of the things that we've seen, and I mentioned it earlier, is that as we got away from express racial zoning, post that Supreme Court case in 1917, what we saw was a rise of, zoning that was on its face not race-based, right? Neutral. But what happened then as zoning proliferated, especially considering it was proliferating during this period of time in which the United States, the powers that be within the United States were pursuing racial segregation under this concept of separate but equal. Well, zoning has this concept of clustering compatible uses, and that is considered to be a legitimate purpose of zoning. And one of the things that we see as we look back through, the transcripts of hearings, the findings, portions of ordinances, and the case law, is that what is the purpose of single-family detached residential zones? And one of the purposes that we see throughout the history of U.S. zoning is to protect these areas from land uses that threaten the compatibility their compatibility as a place for families. And when I talk to my students or others, or when I think about this myself, one of the things that comes up when I start to talk about racial and other oppressive effects of single-family zoning is that there are so many people in the audience of these talks who have good memories of growing up in a single-family area, right? A good or currently really enjoy their maybe urban, urban/ resident or suburban single family area where they live. And so I want to say that the purpose of my talk is not to say that there's something wrong with you if you enjoy that, right? Because one of the things I push for when I'm pushing for reform in this area is to say, let's identify over here what we like about this thing I'm talking about right now, which is single family zoning, what we really enjoy about it, and by we, I mean, let's talk to the public. You're planners, you know this, right? So let's identify what we like about this. What are the benefits? What does the public like? And then ask ourselves, how can we achieve them in a non-discriminatory way? How can we achieve these same benefits without using tools that burden already vulnerable people in our communities? So I'm definitely not saying that if you like to live on a street where there's a house and a lawn and it's quiet, there's not too much traffic, etc., that there's something wrong with you, because I think that so many of us do very much like that, me included. So the problem is really this clustering of nuisance or undesirable land uses and treating multifamily residential as equated with a nuisance, or even if you don't go that far, and I'm sure no one on the commission does this, but treating multifamily residential is still somehow deserving of less protection from really intense land uses than single family residential is. Right? Right. So equating with nuisance, I should probably revise that. But what I'm really saying here is, if single family residential use is deserving of protection from proximity to intense land uses that are harmful to quality of life, then so is multifamily. Because when it comes down to it, it's all residential and families live there, human beings live there. And this has not always been the case, and we're really struggling with the history in this country, right? There's so much racist and classist history in this country. So this is the seminal land use case in the United States. This is the 1926 case of Euclid versus Amber Realty, and I just want to highlight how multifamily is talked about in this case. The US Supreme Court said multifamily residences are like mere parasites that in a residential neighborhood come very near to being nuisances. That's why I used that word nuisance on the last slide. Separation of residential business, including apartments. So at the time, there was the characterization, or with respect to the particular ordinance that was at issue in this case. And industrial land uses promotes the public welfare by, among other things, preserving the residential character of neighborhoods and their desirability as a place of detached residences. And I highlight that residential character of neighborhoods because it suggests that somehow where there's a multifamily residence, it isn't, we don't need to think about residential character there, and a place for families. And that reminds me, I didn't put this on a slide, but of the harm from abstraction, right? One of the things I think about when I think about and I talk about land use law and zoning is that when we talk about land uses and we talk about R1 or single family and multifamily use, it allows us to, that's an abstraction that allows us to not think about who lives there. And, ultimately, I think that abstraction allows for indifference. Right? Indifference to any harm that comes about through the regulation or through our failure to amend regulation. So one of the things about US zoning law is that most land in the United States is reserved for most land in US cities, I should say, is reserved for single family homes on really what are a relatively large lot, especially considering housing shortages. And so in this particular the red here is showing, single family, and the green is showing multifamily, and this is Chicago on the screen. But we could do this for just about every large US city in the United States. that has zoning. And what we would see is that not only are we clustering these more intense, less residential compatible uses with multifamily, we also in the United States have a history of allowing the multifamily in smaller areas of the city. So we're condensing it and then clustering it with less compatible land uses in terms of compatibility with family life. Thankfully, in Oregon and in Eugene, some of the things that contribute to the oppression are already, have already in the past been reformed. Like strict or particularly narrow definitions of family that also keep people out of the single family areas. I did want to say though, and this is a bit outdated, this is from 2017, but I just did a quick search. This is actually when I was house hunting to move here for my job at University of Oregon. And I was looking for the number of houses in Eugene at the time that were available at or below the median home value. And there were 13 on this particular day. So I didn't concoct this search, I was just looking because I was contemplating the move. And some of the things I point out on this slide. So where housing demand is high and we don't, and there's scarcity, then single family residential zoning inflates home values, right? Because it decreases the number of available units by saying, we can't use as much land for housing. And the higher property value ends up meaning higher rents for tenants. And at the same time, it can increase homeowner wealth, at least those who are able to retain the home, so it's reducing rental real incomes while increasing homeowner wealth. So, exacerbating a situation in terms of economics and wealth gaps. And also, really challenging with respect to sprawl or, retaining our growth boundary.
Sarah, so, I hate to interrupt you, but we need to move on to Q&A soon.
Oh, you're right. I'm so sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah. So let me just show you the, just a sec. Okay, so I just have this, I wanted to point out there's a lot of people, in town, people of color, groups that represent communities of color that are also making many of these points. And I just wanted to put this slide here with this quote from Eric Richardson, President Eugene Springfield NAACP, about how this is really a catastrophe for Black communities and other communities of color. And then let me just flag some reform. I'm just gonna point some things out. So one, I have some slides on single family. I'm not going to go into here. I just wanted to point out how it can be really hard to even tell the difference between single family and multifamily, right? Those are the two that are single family on the slide. And then which ones are more intense land uses? It can also be hard to tell the difference, right? And then based on what assumptions? We think they're more intense land uses, but let's really analyze those assumptions. And even if so identify the regulatory requirements that raise the cost of housing or limit multifamily housing, critically examine assumptions about how, more dense housing is, if it really is more intense or less compatible with less dense housing. And when we're not sure, sometimes I say, I hear, let's not do any reform because it's uncertain. What if we erred on the side of equity, right? And then some other things that I just want to say that I think are really essential in the reform process. So integrating environmental and climate justice questions into land use and zoning, integrating anti-displacement strategies into planning and regulations, and reforming public participation processes so that the public and the affected public are involved early on throughout the planning at a post-assessment, so that there's a recursive process where the public is involved throughout the whole thing, which Eugene has been doing some fantastic public involvement that I'm aware of. These slides will be available later, so I'm not gonna go through all of them, but these are some more things for consideration for reform. I can come back to this too. There was one that I'll put these back up. in a moment. But, we're thinking a lot about climate in Oregon right now too, and climate related reforms. And, and thinking about where people have access to housing, that also means who has access to fill in the blank, but this slide is just kind of highlighting mobility resources, for example, that reduce vehicle miles traveled. I'm going to go back to the reform slides and just leave them on the screen. And that's the end of my formal presentation. Terry, thank you for the reminder on time.
Well, thank you, Professor. That was really terrific. Thank you for joining us today. I was actually going to, instead of ask a question, I was ask you if you could put these slides back up, so you did. So, Commissioner Edwards.
Thank you, Chair Ramey. I have one question, and Sarah, thank you so much. I really appreciate all your work. I read through your, I guess you'd call this an article, and I could not put it down. It was excellent, so thank you. I have a question related to the environmental justice issue that you spoke about. And one of the things that we talk about doing and with incentivizing certain types of housing and multifamily, it's incentivizing it near transit. And I personally have always kind of questioned like how I know that makes sense from a land use standpoint, makes really good sense. And I happen to work for LTD, so I just in full disclosure, but areas where transit runs are also the areas that are where there are major arterials and a lot of pollution. It's where transportation greenhouse gases are emitted in higher levels than anywhere else. And so I'm curious about how you resolve that conflict and how that, what your thoughts are on those types of decisions and whether or not they're consistent with, trying to take a different approach in the way that we plan for housing and those types of things.
Yeah, I mean, and thank you, Commissioner Edwards, and thank you so much also for that, for saying you couldn't put that article down. I don't think law professors ever hear that about their articles. So that was really kind. So I mean, I think what you're raising is it's difficult because it's true. I mean, we have these smart growth principles, right? Of and transit-oriented design, and there definitely is climate benefit to that. There can even be accessibility to job and school to that. But it, also the reality is that, like for example, in Oregon could have said, let's promote middle housing near transit, full stop, right? But Oregon instead said as a state, the legislature, no, we're going to require the allowance, not requiring that it be developed, but the allowance for some forms of middle housing in all single family districts on all lots that allow single family. And so, and I think one of the problems with focusing too much on clustering near transit, is that it can continue to promote this segregation problem and the environmental justice problem of putting the housing that's most accessible for lower income people, which really income became a proxy for race, right? After that U.S. Supreme Court in 1917, where the cities could no longer expressly zone based on race, they found at that time that they could achieve the same effect, by planning, and treating income as a proxy. So now, even if it's not intentional, the question is, well, even though we don't have this racial intent, hopefully, when I say that I'm talking about, planning commissioners all over and local government officials all over. We now have the knowledge of the effect. So one thing I realize is we know about the effect. Let's stop even arguing about intent, because if we fail to address the effect, then who cares about intent? And so I don't have an easy answer, Commissioner Edwards. I'm just saying that it's so, I think, tempting to kind of continue what's already happened with its negative effect under the guise of something beneficial, which is really a lot of what we saw with the urban renewal that we now know was so discriminatory. So we can look back on more recent history and see things under the guise of something truly beneficial and see massive, discriminatory and oppressive effect. So I would just say to be incredibly careful. And, I think probably one of the best ways is what the legislature is already requiring, which is, some people are going to want to live near transit. But if we're promoting middle housing and we're not putting up barriers to the development of middle housing in all single family areas that allow single family structures, which is what the House Bill 2001 requires, then I think the ideal situation is that we end up having options. Whereas right now, thinking back to my slide with the 13, only 13 available, there's just no options. So if we can spread it out so that people can actually choose which kind of neighborhood they want to live in, whether it's close to transit, even though you have that pollution trade-off, I think that's probably, that's really what's essential.
Thank you.
I've got Commissioner Taylor and then Terry. I want you keep us honest on time here.
So thank you so much, Sarah. I'm going to expand what Commissioner Edwards said. I manage an architecture and planning firm, and your materials are going to be required reading as far as our efforts towards anti-racism and anti-discrimination. So there you go. Even your papers from an attorney are being read by a wider audience and required. So thank you. I appreciate it. So I think you brought up a couple of really, really good focus questions for me as we go through this. And I think staff has been doing a good job, as well as the other boards and commissions. And it's really this question of what are those elements of what we loved when we grew up? And it doesn't mean if you have a multifamily housing unit structure that they all want to be close to that transit corridor. Single families might want to be close to the corridor, the transit corridor. So it really is our kind of idea that multifamily be located to a transit corridor is perpetuating that income proxy for race, really. Because if you look at us, we're all residents living in different housing types, and we all have different needs and desires. So just looking at the residential neighborhood as something open and not differentiating between R1 or single family or single units versus multi-units. So I really appreciate that kind of focus and your presentation. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Taylor. And one of the things too, and why I pulled up this slide is that let's expand how we think about transit, and what are all the transit options that we're thinking about? And oftentimes, and of course, this leads to really challenging questions about money, right? We often see the development of bike trails and sidewalks connected to new development because it can be funded by the new development. And it's much more challenging to fund when it's in an existing area, but that also perpetuates the problem. And so some of those things are going to be needed to be addressed, I think, in reforms that are greater than just zoning reforms. But who are we developing bike path for? If we're only developing it on the outskirts, is it even really that helpful for getting, riding your bike to your job? And some of this goes beyond Eugene, because to other cities as well. But there's some cities where all that bike path is just all on the outskirts, and it's only recreational because of that, as opposed to actually being a mobility resource that takes you to jobs and schools. Other things too. When we're thinking transit oriented, let's look at our existing neighborhoods, those that have the lowest income, that have the highest proportions of people of color, and say, do they have safe ways to travel to school, to grocery, to the urban core, and safe via bike, safe via walking, etc.
Commissioner Isaacson.
Thank you. I also found this to be incredibly moving and powerful. There's a statistic that I heard a while back that I use to kind of frame things through this lens. And it's to actually look at the first census that Oregon had in 1860, only a few years after we came into the Union. There was one person of color in all of Lane County, one. There were only a handful in the entire state, because that was the deal that we struck to be able to come into the Union. Was a state that pretty much just outlawed folks who are a person of color. So we started out with that framework and then built all of our infrastructure around it. So everything we do, to a certain degree, has to dismantle some of that and add on new things. And so if we don't put it through that lens, I don't think that we're doing our job. So thank you.
All right, Terry.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I so hate to cut this conversation short, but it is so relevant to what we have coming up next. And I just want to extend another thank you to Sarah. I know we're going to want to see your slides, so thank you for passing those along, and to the commissioners for your thoughtful questions. One of the things you said was we need to make strides to improve our public involvement processes, and we have been trying to do that with this project. In fact, our next speakers are from the Healthy Democracy Representative Panel. And so thank you, Sarah. Thanks for your presentation, and we'll see you again soon, we hope.
Thank you.
You're welcome to stay on. You're welcome to stay on. We're only 10 minutes behind. I think we're doing pretty good. We have 3 guests though, Francisco and Jose from the Healthy Democracy Panel, and then Dylan from our developer focus group. And so I have them going in that order, and would like to just turn it over to Francisco now instead of wasting time kind of screen sharing and doing those things. I think I'll just pass it over to Francisco.
Hello. So, hi, my name is Francisco, and I have been a Eugene resident for the past 18 years. Last fall, I was selected by random simulation to be a part of a review panel that was put together by the City of Eugene and Healthy Democracy. As you may know, this process prioritized diversity by ensuring the panel was comprised of Eugenians from all walks of life, which included a diverse range of race, ethnicity, gender, age, disability status, renter or homeowner status, and more. Our main objective as a panel was to establish key principles that will help guide the city as it drafts new code to abide by HB 2001. We were presented with information that related to the history of housing in Oregon. Healthy Democracy brought in several experts on the issue to learn more about HB 2001 and how the code worked. After many hours of deliberation and hard work by panelists, and while taking into consideration different perspectives, concerns, values, and hopes, the panel crafted 41 principles to guide the work of the Middle Housing Project. We simply don't have all the time to state all 41 guiding principles, but here's our top 5 based on a voting system. Number 1, affordable housing is of paramount importance. The second one is provision for continuous improvement of policy. Establish a periodic formal review process on existing policy to change accordingly. And that kind of resonates with what Sarah said at the end of her presentation, that the public needs to continue being engaged. Number 3, expedite the process of securing affordable housing for those that need it the most. Number 4, maintain affordability for newly constructed middle housing when replacing existing affordable structures. And number 5, zoning codes need to serve the needs of the general population. And those are our top 5 principles. Thank you. Now my remaining time is open for questions.
Thank you for that presentation, Francisco. Terrific. I love the 5. I love having from 40 to 5. That cannot have been easy, and that is a credit to your guys as a group to pull that together. That's very helpful. Commissioner Taylor.
Francisco, thank you so much for your time and commitment to this. And what I would love to do is get your feedback on it. What else can we do? Obviously, we've got the remaining parts of this process. What's your experience been so far? Are there things that can be added, or what can we do for the remaining of the process, and any thoughts you have on that?
Well, I think it is the feedback that you probably, the people in charge of making the code, the people in charge of regulating this process need to be in touch with the public, whether via the way Healthy Democracy did, which I think they did a fantastic job. That's what I think it should be happening, because we were presented with a lot of information and so many presenters, and we really appreciate all the help from Healthy Democracy and the City of Eugene and everybody that participated.
Commissioner Borowski.
Thank you, and thank you for your time on that panel. I guess what I would hope to hear from you is, this was a new template for the City of Eugene for getting public engagement using the Healthy Democracy folks to help get us this diverse and broad public outreach. I went through and was reading the surveys that you guys took, and one of the things that I was curious about was the stipend. And just for you, I mean, now that you've been in one of these public outreach type of things, I'm sure that the stipend may not be quite as important to you or other people on the group, because you see the work that's been done. But as far as bringing you in, how important was the fact that you were going to be compensated for helping to do this? Because it seems like it brought in a lot of people that may not have answered the letter in the first place. And I'm just curious about that as it relates to you.
Well, I think from my personal opinion, I think it was, I felt that it was important to participate in this type of process. Because as I mentioned, I've been living here for almost 20 years now. And I want to make sure that what we do or how we implement this HB 2001, that it's actually something that my input help with this process. So I think that's my main reason why I did it.
Great. Yeah, I just, we got a lot more people that, I've been on the Planning Commission for several years, and whenever we do public outreach, it seems like we always, there's a certain core group of people that kind of will give us input. And this one, we got a lot of input from people that we don't normally hear from, and it was very encouraging. And so I'm just wanting to figure out the best way that we can continue that going forward. So I appreciate you guys coming and helping us out.
Of course.
So thank you, Francisco. The second Healthy Democracy speaker, Jose, is going to touch on the public engagement recommendations. And so we'll turn it over to Jose.
Good afternoon, commissioners, city staff, and fellow roundtable panelists. My name is Jose Melendez, and I was a member of the Middle Housing Review Panel and a member of the process committee for the panel, which reviews surveys conducted after every session to see how the experience was going. The review panel prepared the report on public engagement recommendations as advised to city staff. Before I dive into our public engagement recommendations to the city, I want to highlight two things that distinguish the review panel from others. As members of the public, panelists speak for how a policy decision would impact them. They are not speaking as representatives of groups, such as those typically found in other types of public engagement scenarios, where individuals from nonprofits or interest groups speak for a collective. As such, when in the past commissioners, as Borowski just highlighted, or city staff wish that they could hear from members of the public directly who are not your typical participants, the panel is indeed those voices. Over the course of 15 meetings, over 6 months, the 30 panelists at first engaged in a joint onboarding experience that created a foundation of knowledge that we could all pull from in our subsequent work. This orientation to the issue of middle housing also sets this process apart from your typical survey respondent, who may spend 15 to 20 minutes filling out a survey, but most likely without the hours of education on the background of the issue. Thus, the process committee developed a survey to gauge what we could learn from this unique experience to recommend to the city for them to take up in subsequent public engagement practices. You have all been given the report, so I will not review each recommendation individually, but instead will provide general impressions of the potential that this middle housing review panel holds for the city. First, do not dismiss direct mailings as a way to reach the public. 89% of the public, 89% of the people on this panel had not participated in any public engagement process before, and they all responded to the direct mailing. Most would not be found browsing through city websites or the networks that you could send public announcements to. Therefore, this panel is proof of the ability to reach a brand new group of individuals. 48% would respond to another direct mailing call for participation. Even in the time of Zoom, most of the panelists enjoy the experience of serving because they felt they were doing meaningful work and were given the tools necessary to do so. This included the onboarding process, a range of accommodations, and a sense of protection for the political influences of those who most typically engage in participatory processes, who by the nature of this panel may feel less empowered to exert their influence over the outcomes. The panelists engage in the practices of democracy, learning about the issue, questioning experts, coming up with principles, deliberating with one another on their wording and value, sharing their personal experiences, getting to know one another, and voting on which direction to go. It was meaningful work. The city would benefit from reviewing other engagement venues to assess what are the practices those venues engage the public in. Remember that the engagement practices the city designs shapes the experiences of the public and their identity as citizens and residents. Fourth, do not let these panelists disappear into time. They are invested. They would be receptive to further city outreach to figure out what other venues they could engage in. 86% would volunteer if asked. Not only for housing, 96% said they would continue serving on the panel if extended, but across a range of issues. But be mindful, if the engagement processes they are invited to do not provide opportunities for meaningful work, they may sour on volunteering soon enough. I will end by sharing that I happen to be a professor of planning at the School of Planning, Public Policy and Management, with a research focus on the design of decision-making processes, in particular for members from underrepresented communities. I did not participate in this panel as an expert, but as a Latino immigrant member of the public who happened to be a renter in Ward 5. It was a highly rewarding experience to get to know so many other residents of Eugene over so many months of meaningful work together. I was amazed by how this panel hits so many of the qualities of what are considered positive engagement practices in the research on this topic. Of course, there's always room for improvement, but nevertheless, given how challenged other more well-known public engagement processes are, I advise the city of Eugene to not let this unique learning opportunity go to waste. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you for taking time today. Thank you for being a part of the panel. It once again instills in me great faith that the city of Eugene has what it takes in its members, such as the two of you, and I'm sure our third panelist as well, our third speaker today, to really get things done and make a difference. And it can't happen if you don't spend the time. So I really appreciate you doing so. Commissioner Taylor.
Thank you, Jose. I appreciate the thoughtfulness of both you and Francisco. Is there a way that was really well organized? Francisco's was as well. Is there a way we can, if you've sent some of this feedback to staff, it would be great to actually have this and be able to have it as part of the record and further and reference in the future.
I can submit it. I can submit my testimony to city staff.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thank you for the recommendations, not only for the remaining part of the process, both Francisco and Jose, but also thinking about future processes. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay, Terry, we might be ready to move on.
Awesome. Great. Thanks again, Jose and Francisco, and you're welcome to stay on, but we're going to turn it over to Dylan to tell us about his experience serving on the developer focus group.
Okay, am I coming through okay? All right. Thanks for having me. I really appreciated hearing the testimonies or the presentations from Sarah, Jose, and Francisco. Adding to the kind of palette, I'm here to speak about a couple of developer focus group sessions we had organized by Better Housing Together. So I'm one of about 24 architects and developers who met together, developers of both market rate housing as well as affordable housing developers. And we spoke about, I'm just going to kind of basically come through and hit the high points of the summary document that Better Housing Together put together. I believe I have 5 minutes, so I'm going to try to keep it short. As was mentioned by Sarah very clearly, the current code was developed and refined over time to restrict and block certain people from having access to certain areas. And that really, I think I'm very, I'm so encouraged to see this very refreshing approach of examining, starting from that point as we begin to examine these code reforms. Comments from some of the group, the fear of infill and multiple households per lot is really unfounded. Outcomes are often very positive and desirable. New housing is high quality, energy efficient, and many people are seeking smaller housing types, which have not historically been produced by our zoning constraints. The cost of on-site and project infrastructure really needs to be addressed. That's next, after the number of units you can put on a lot, the cost of infrastructure is definitely the #2 driver of housing cost, at least drivers that we have control over. Lot coverage, 50% lot coverage maximum seems like a very unnecessary limit. It's a very hard ceiling that doesn't fare well with all the other considerations, #1 being how to produce more housing in our city. It's particularly problematic for small lot infill. Perhaps we should think about using a sliding scale where smaller lots are allowed to have increased coverage. We already have setback requirements on all lots, and those are adequate and generally for generally safeguarding, neighboring conflicts and whatnot. So that 50% lot coverage, again, the general group felt that was a pretty low or overly restrictive bar, high bar, I guess. Special area zone comments. And these, what I'm responding to are questions the city staff posed to the group. So they kind of jump around randomly. That's the reason for that. Special area zones. All middle housing should be exempt from special area zone specific design standards. Exclusivity and obstructionism in some neighborhoods is a problem. I got here first should not be driving decisions about community-wide housing needs. Multiplexes. Should they be attached or detached? In other words, HB 2001 allows for a triplex to be 3 detached units, and the staff was interested in how that affects feasibility for projects. The group really saw value in both attached and detached, and we recommend to keep both options on the table. Attached housing, of course, is more affordable to build, but often site constraints on existing lots just don't allow it to be built. So if you require it to be attached, it's likely going to remove a large number of lots from the candidate pool of what can get developed. In particular, we should really encourage you to remove the requirements for houses, multiplexes, and townhouses to be on their own lot. Eugene has this requirement. Portland, for example, does not. Speaking from experience, 10 years ago when I was with Greenhammer in Portland, we developed a 7-unit courtyard apartment complex that was 3 townhouses and 2 duplexes all on one lot, and they were owned as condominiums. Ankeny Row is the name of the project if you want to Google it. It was beloved by the community, won awards, I still see it referenced in presentations nationally. So again, Eugene is completely removing projects like that from possibility because they require units to be on their own lot. And that requires fee simple ownership, essentially. It requires partitioning lots and time and expense for that. Townhouses, there's no need for frontage requirements for townhouses. Deep lots often have a good potential for kind of sideways townhouses. There are plenty of historic examples of where courtyard apartments and whatnot face an inner court like that. So again, by requiring frontage requirements for townhouses, we're removing a very viable and historically proven model from its palette of options for housing. And again, don't require townhouses to be on their own lot. Parking. Basically requiring parking directly conflicts with the desire for more housing, more naturescape, and reducing carbon emissions. Generally, the group felt that we should let the market lead, not regulation here. If private off-street parking is important to people, it will get built. There's no need to require it. Some lenders require parking to finance a project, but they don't do that necessarily in walkable neighborhoods. So lending practices will change with our housing and our neighborhood changes, and we can trust the market to lead that. Requiring off-street parking will make many sites completely infeasible. Sloped sites, sites without alleys in particular, where the existing house is really blocking access to the rear of the lot, which is many, many lots. So again, requiring off-street parking is probably the #1 killer, so to speak, of allowing more missing middle housing. Where we are requiring parking, consider allowing things like tandem parking, one car behind the other. Speaking from experience, as biking and walking become more viable, cars more and more become just a tool we use on the weekend to get out of town, and they're often not moved for many days at a time. So tandem parking in that context starts to make a lot more sense. It also makes more sense when we start doing things like car shares among, say, a multiplex of 4 units of housing. If you collectively own a couple of electric smart cars, you can tandemly park those and just take the one in back. Another thing to point out, garages are often just used for storage. So just because we're requiring the off-street parking doesn't mean it's actually being used for cars. It's being used for the highest and best use for that owner. Design standards. Generally, we should allow these to be more flexible. The one the group particularly talked about was requiring front doors to face the street. That should be loosened up to be anything from front doors to porches to even gateways that are part of a small cluster of housing, and that we should allow a cluster of housing for those doors to face inward to an inner courtyard. There's plenty of historic examples of that being successful and contributing to the streetscapes beautifully. So it's an example of creating a design standard that's eliminating possibility in a negative way. The adjustment review process also to circumvent those kind of bad regulations could be very onerous. They add time and cost to projects. In particular, on busy streets with traffic moving over 40 miles an hour, homes should not be required to face the street. The street is a pretty hostile zone to housing at that point, so allow housing to turn its back, so to speak, to a street that's noxious to humanity. Incentives, #1, I would say, in terms of allowing middle housing to produce affordable housing, is to create a deeper affordability density bonus for affordable housing. That would essentially, what Portland has done there is allow a 6 to an 8-plex to be developed on a lot when it's developed as affordable housing. That is allowing more units on the lot by affordable housing developers allows them to purchase a lot and compete with market rate developers. Probably the number one way to actually see affordable housing get produced by this law. And it can reduce public subsidy by a factor of 10. Right now, I'm in construction on essentially a 6-plex in Springfield that's developed as 6 suites that are in a single family house and ADU. We're doing this under current regulations, not HB 2001 regulations. And we need a subsidy for that through Square One Villages of about $23,000 per unit. Again, about a tenth of the typical subsidy of capital A affordable housing. And we're hitting the same affordability metrics, but we're also doing it as ownership housing, not renter. It will also be permanently affordable to the community. So we're doing that as a housing cooperative. I could give you another presentation on that another time. Utility connections, again, infrastructure costs are really the number 2 challenge for affordable housing or just housing affordability in general. Trying to get the city public works department and eWeb to partner on incentives and SDC waivers is really critical to seeing more affordable housing get developed. Developing a middle housing MUPTI, tax exemption to increasing density and prioritizing certain areas would align with our sustainability goals. And again, a density bonus would be more manageable than an SDC waiver, for example, because often SDC waiver programs are not adequately funded. And so they can get eaten up by a single project. So allowing a density bonus is, again, a free way for the city to create more affordable housing. It costs them nothing. And instead, it just brings about more of exactly what we need through natural market forces. Finally, city should really consider using a pro-forma analysis to help inform the details of how these laws are written. Without a pro-forma, without having someone to run numbers on an example, take 5 random lots and run pro-formas on them based on different ways we're looking at crafting the law. And you can see right away which options are actually going to create, which law are actually going to create more housing and which will have no chance of creating housing. But without running a pro-forma analysis, you're really flying blind to know how the market is going to respond to a certain given set of regulations. Closing thoughts, please prioritize flexibility. Infill housing is already financially very challenging. It can really only service luxury markets right now, luxury buyers. So really looking, I liked what Sarah said, from a place of equity and erring on the side of equity rather than restriction is really number 1 recommendation. I don't know, probably went over there, but thank you very much for your time. Thank you all the commissioners for all the time you put into this work. And again, we really appreciate your time.
Dylan, thank you for joining us today. I see Commissioner Edwards, your hand is up, but Terry, do you want to, is there something you need to course correct us on here?
No, I put my hand up as attempting to signal to Dylan that he was out of time. I'm so sorry.
Oh,
I'm so sorry.
Little too subtle there, Terry. Okay, Edwards.
You need like a code, like a, winking or something. Thank you, Dylan. I have a quick I have a quick comment. Just reading that Senate Bill 458 passed the House today. So I just got the press release actually literally while you were speaking. So that does actually talk a lot about a lot of those ownership opportunities. So, I think that actually will have some impact to this work. It's just headed to the governor's desk. So pending no holdups there, we should see some new legislation. My question to you is, as I'm looking through some of the code recommendations that we're looking at, and we're kind of categorizing incentivizing versus allowing, encouraging, incentivizing, and I mean, I've been pretty frank that I'm on the encourage to incentivize, but I'm curious as to whether or not you feel that in your work that there are some circumstances in which the incentives start to compete with one another. and that choices should be made between incentivizing this type of housing or these types of programs versus others. Because I mean, I'd love to just incentivize everything, but actually in thinking that through, an extra thought, I start to think that, well, but if we incentivize everything, then we are not as focused on certain things, and maybe that's the approach. So I'm curious of your thoughts on that, if that came up at all in the focus group or with the developers.
It didn't, but I personally feel like we're nowhere near having so many incentives that they're a problem with one another. I do though think that focusing on, you know, say 2 really effective incentive pathways would be better than a smattering of 10 that are only marginally effective. Again, you need a pro forma to really suss out which is going to actually have an effect. I would go back to the top 2 things that affect the cost of housing, which is the number of units you can put on a lot and the cost of infrastructure. There's really only so much we can do to reduce the cost of a given structure, and we're really good at doing that. It's fully within the developer and contractor's means to tackle that problem, but we can't do a thing about, you know, the Springfield project we're doing. Again, it's a different jurisdiction, but you know, for a house and an ADU that are serving 6 households, our permit and SDC fees are about $42,000. Normally that would only be for 2 households, of course, but we're spreading that cost over 6. So SDC fees are really a problem. And if we don't allow a density bonus for affordable housing, we're really only going to see new middle housing be for a luxury buyer's market. I can pretty much assure you of that. I don't think affordable housing developers, they have a hard enough time developing, you know, 100+ unit properties, and they're really good at doing that. They're not going to waste their time on trying to develop a 4-plex. But if there are incentives in place for affordable housing developers, I can see innovative developers like Square One Villages really getting involved and saying, oh, here's a market opportunity for us to be effective in the community and pursue our mission of serving low-income families. If we don't have that density bonus, if we don't have some effective SDC waivers, you know, we're not going to see them come to the table and try and make that happen. Yeah.
Thank you. Super helpful.
Yeah, thank you.
Dylan, I did just a follow-up question on the concept of deep, did you call it deep affordability? Deep something.
Yeah, deeper affordability, yeah.
Deeper.
I think that's the verbiage from Portland.
Well, I'm all for that. That sounds great. Were you talking, so the Portland program, is that 6 units that are all affordable, or is it some ratio of the units that has to be affordable? How does that work?
In the way Portland has implemented the law, I don't believe all units have to be affordable. Forgive me, I'm not familiar with it's been a little while since I've looked at it, but my understanding is you're allowed up to 6 or maybe 8 units on a lot if 1 or 2 units are affordable. And that I would say makes it possible for market rate developers like myself to make that happen, because then you can, within the same project, use the luxury units to subsidize the low income. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for coming, Dylan.
Thank you all.
That was really great. And the memo that Dylan was reading from is attached to the packet. And so that's available in the packet that's on the website for the public as well as the commission. Okay, so everybody take a deep breath. We're gonna shift gears here and start talking about the code recommendations. As you all know, we've been talking at a concept level. We've had some really great work by Matt Hasty and Kate Rogers from Angelo Planning Group, and they're here today to help us walk through some straw polls. And just to explain what that means a little bit. So we're in the middle of a code amendment project, and the code has not been written, all of it yet, but we've been assembling your thoughts as well as all of the groups that we've been reaching out to on concepts. And so the verbiage around allow, encourage, incentivize is tied to much more detailed explanations of the code ideas in the memos that Angela Planning has produced. So as we're talking through these different items, you may need to reference your packet from your meeting on April 26th. That's the packet that the page numbers refer to. So if you're looking for, what does it mean if I'm saying I'm okay with encouraging attached and detached plexes? Well, there'll be a page number in the table in your packet that'll explain it in more detail. What we thought we would do is take these one by one, and I think the first couple are going to be easy, and then we'll get into some good discussion as we go along. I've asked Sophie to keep track of your straw poll votes, and so I am going to share my screen, and we'll just kind of see how this goes. I don't know why I'm not seeing it on both screens. Are you guys seeing my screen?
Yes, but we're seeing all of your other slides.
How about now?
Nope, now we see it without the slide, so this is perfect.
And you don't see my notes?
Nope, no notes.
Perfect. All right, this is what I wanted to do. So the first one looks like this, and there are 13. So the first straw poll is about the overall code approach, and I've just pulled this from your memo. There's a project team recommendation, in this case, encourage, incentivize. A shorthand description, in this case, remove barriers, encourage housing, more housing across Eugene. And then this reference material that I was talking about, which shows you where in the packet to find more information. And then my plan was to call each commissioner's name in alphabetical order here and have you say yes if you agree with the project team recommendation. So if you say no, I'll stop and say, what is your recommendation? And it would be helpful if you could use the terminology that we're using. So you'd prefer a different approach, and that different approach is the allow approach or whatever it is. And then Sophie will be carefully recording that. We'll also have the meeting recording when we're done. Does that make sense to everyone? Commissioner Edwards.
Sorry, I was trying to find my hand raised. But I'm seeing though that you have encourage to incentivize. You don't want us to specify encourage or incentivize, or you're okay with just a kind of a range?
Well, for this one, the overall approach is pretty nuanced. So it's not across the board encourage, it's not across the board incentivize. So this first one is a little bit different than most of the others.
I will just quickly say that I think that for me, if there are distinctions that need to be made between encourage and incentivize, that in your recommendations you recommended and encourage rather than incentivize, I think I may have questions about like why that and not that. So if that's helpful, I just think I have a lot of questions as far as just like going through and so I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, that's great. And that's why we have Matt and Kate here to answer questions about the recommendations. This one is kind of the easiest because it's the most general. And it's right from your memo since we started working on this. So we took this direction from you, and I'm assuming that you're all going to agree with it. But if I'm wrong, the meeting will take a lot longer than I'm hoping. So we could try with the first one. And then I think what you're saying about questions absolutely is going to come up, and there'll be questions. What does this mean? What does this mean? You know, to have a kind of shorthand for a recommendation. Any other questions about kind of the straw poll methodology? This is fun, you guys. Okay, so let's give it a shot. For overall code approach, Commissioner Borowski, what is your recommendation? You can say yes if you agree with the project staff team recommendation.
Yes.
Beeson?
Yes.
Edwards? She nodded.
Yes, sorry. Yes.
Fragala.
So I'm assuming that the shorthand description is remove barriers, encourage and incentivize more housing across Eugene, since encourage and incentivize is the recommendation. Is that how we're interpreting it?
That would be a better shorthand, yes.
Correct.
So that's what I'm looking for, is that the shorthand is encourage and incentivize, so yes.
Okay, great. I'll make that edit. Isaacson.
Yes.
Ramey.
Yes.
And Taylor.
Yes, and I agree with Commissioner Fragler's addition.
Great. That I consider that a clarification, so I don't think I need to re-poll people. I think that worked. We can move on. This one's a little bit more specific. It's item number 2. Should the code allow detached plexes or attached only? And the project team recommendation is summarized as encourage, incentivize. And the shorthand description is to allow both attached and detached plexes for flexibility. And reference page 8 of the packet. And I'll call for commissioners' votes here. Commissioner Borowski.
I guess I have a question, because the encourage and incentivize have differences, right? One of them has to do with what the incentives are. So how can I vote for encourage to incentivize if I'm leaning one way or another on different incentives?
Yeah, I might have to call on Kate or Matt to help me answer this one, but I can't right now. I'm not remembering if there was a difference between encourage.
In this case, the question really is: do you allow both attached and detached, or attached only? There's not really a difference between there's no difference between encourage and incentivize. So it's kind of combined. Yeah, it's really a kind of either or question.
So I was just looking at page 8 of the other one. So this one has nothing to do with the SDCs and those types of enhanced incentivizations. This is just whether or not we want to allow detached.
In terms of the pure code update, it's really, do you allow detached units for plexes?
And would that be an encourage or would that be incentivized?
They're the same in this case.
They're the same. In this particular case, they're the same. Yeah.
And then I can vote for yes.
Thank you. Commissioner Beeson?
Yes.
Commissioner Edwards?
Yes.
Commissioner Fragla?
Yes.
Commissioner Isaacson?
Yes.
Commissioner Ramey?
Okay, wait a minute. So this is every unit. What if you think one might work, but others wouldn't work? Should I vote no then?
Well, it's not your only time, of course. What we're looking for is the general will of the commission to write the code that we're bringing back to you in June.
Okay.
But yes, as I understand, and again, Matt, jump in if I'm wrong, this would allow each duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes to be attached as well as detached.
Yeah, and that's kind of the way we've asked the question up to this point. We haven't really, but we could. Yeah, I mean, you all could say, well, I like that for duplexes, but not, and triplexes, but not for quadplexes. But that's not the way we've been asking the question in previous meetings with y'all. We've asked it in this more general way.
Okay. Well, maybe. How about that? I mean, if there's a way to, again, understand the size of the units that result from this action, I could maybe get my hands around it. But you're going to have that answer for me several times during this session.
That's fair. And we'll take notes on what those questions are so that we can consider them in what we bring back to you.
Just to be more specific, if we were going down the deep affordability route and one of the detached duplexes had to be affordable, that would be a different answer for me.
Yeah, okay. With this one, we're trying to get at, should the code be flexible enough in terms of attachment or detachment of the structures? But I hear your question and we'll take it back to the team. Commissioner Beeson, do you want to revise your vote?
No, I don't. I guess a clarification, and I had some trouble with this early on, but in fact, the Oregon statute and the Oregon the regulations provide for this. So to the extent we went through it and did some modification to not do that quite so much, wouldn't we be restricting?
You are allowed to either, via the OARs, you can either define duplexes, triplexes, and or quadplexes as only attached, or you can define them as either attached or detached.
Okay.
Either of those is consistent with the set of administrative rules.
Okay, that answers it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Commissioner Borowski?
Yeah, I guess this kind of, Commissioner Ramey kind of brought this up or made me think about it. So again, this could be 2 4,000 square foot houses on a lot. Basically an AD, it could basically make the ADU regulations mute, right? Because those say
ADUs
800
would still
square
be allowed, and Jeff's got he unmuted.
Yeah, so just to be clear, if something is developed, even if it's detached as a fourplex, triplex, duplex, those will be classified still as duplexes. ADUs are only granted to detached single family dwellings.
Right, but what I'm saying right now is, okay, yeah. I'm just worried about, we're trying to do this to do affordability, and we might get 2 big houses on a lot that could be, I don't know. I'll go for it on this one. Maybe it'll get addressed later on.
And I would say affordability and flexibility. Affordability is not the only objective or goal of HB 2001 or of these regulations. So it's an important goal, but it's not the only one. I think that's a good thing to remember. Choice and flexibility are also important. Options. I mean, I think really ultimately options was kind of the driving choice or the driving intent of the legislation.
I would just add that if we're going down the road of adding options, I would like those options to create affordability. Otherwise, we just adopt the model code and we would have been done a long time ago.
So Commissioner Ramey, we can record you as maybe, and I like that because it sort of gives us a gauge. Originally, I was thinking, tell us what your recommendation is. If it's not encourage, incentivize, what is it? But actually a yes or maybe or no might give us better information and let us know that you have some questions, and we can follow up with people as needed as we go forward. So does that sound okay? Is that maybe for you? Okay. Or it depends. Commissioner Taylor?
Yes.
All right. Sophie, I'm trusting we got everybody recorded for that one. 2 down. Good job. Okay, number 3 is cottages on individual or common lots. This one might be usurped by the state legislation that requires us to allow division onto individual lots. But nonetheless, we are recommending that we allow both individual cottages on individual lots and cottage clusters, in effect, on one common lot. And I'll call for your vote on this one. Commissioner Borowski.
Yes.
Commissioner Beeson.
Yes.
Commissioner Edwards.
Yes.
Commissioner Fragala.
I had a question about this. So Dylan was talking about how requiring units to be on their own lots was a barrier. And so this is not doing that. This is just creating flexibility, correct?
Correct.
Okay, I'm a yes, thank you.
Commissioner Isaacson.
Yes.
Commissioner Ramey.
Yes.
And Commissioner Taylor.
My answer is yes, and I have a follow-up question. Are we going to also be given an opportunity to look at other middle housing, like townhouses, for instance, that's currently required on individual lots where we actually So do we have another vote for other types of housing? This is specific to cottages. I would like to expand it to other middle housing for both individual lots and common lots. Are we going to get a chance to look at that?
Lauren's got an answer.
I don't have an answer to your specific question, Commissioner Taylor, but I would point out that what was now House Bill 2001 and is in statute defines townhomes specifically as on their own lots. So that is part of the definition of the statute that we have limited flexibility to mess with. The other housing types, there's a lot more flexibility in terms of individual lots or not.
Thank you for the clarification. I remember you said that last time. So thank you. So it would be all other middle housing except for townhouses because it's been really strictly defined. Got it. So we'll have a chance to vote on that, I'm hearing. Yep.
Well, I would add that the legislation hasn't passed yet. And so we're going to have to do a lot of follow-up work to figure out how to make this work in our code and address development applications through the life of the housing and how we keep track of what kind of housing it is and what rules apply.
But we will get a chance to vote on other middle housing. I just want to clarify that.
Lauren.
I'll jump in again. So I think I'm hearing a couple of different questions. I think Commissioner Frageles specifically asked, are we providing flexibility by allowing individual lots or common lots? I mean, obviously the question before you is specific to cottage clusters, but kind of generally, are we allowing common lots or individual lots, or are we requiring that middle housing be developed on its own individual lots? And I think that I just want to clarify that the state law that Commissioner Edwards mentioned that has now passed both houses and is awaiting signatures from the Speaker, the Senate President, and the Governor would require cities to allow folks to subdivide or partition their lots so that individual units of middle housing could be constructed on individual lots, but there's no requirement that folks do that. Sort of except for townhouses, which are defined specifically as on their own individual lots. So if what is being proposed is a townhouse development, then they would need to sit on individual lots. But I think you could have a situation, and we've talked about that before, where you have a attached triplex or quadplex that looks a lot like a townhouse development, but is all on a single lot or something. So I think what we're talking about is a lot of flexibility, and Terry is absolutely right that as more flexibility is added through either recommendations of Planning Commission or through state law telling us that we need to add it, it becomes a lot more difficult just to tell by looking at a development what sort of housing type it is. And so staff will have to think about how to ensure that we understand what's being proposed, we understand what's being built, and that sort of designation carries through time. So that's maybe more information than you wanted.
So I'm hearing the regulations. So really my question, if you want direction right now, and maybe I'll be really clear, is yes on this one and yes on all other housing types that the state is not necessarily regulating, like townhouses we know now. And my only question was, are the other commissioners going to be allowed to look at other housing types to give you some direction about encourage, incentivize for both individual lots and common lots for flexibility for all other middle housing types, with the exception, obviously, as Lauren noted, townhouses. So I just want to make sure, are we going to vote on that too? Because this is really particular to cottages. And I would like that flexibility to be all middle housing. And obviously we have another House bill that's in front and we might not need to vote on it, but I just wanted to give you that information.
Okay, I will take note of it. We don't have it teed up as a question, and I think we do want to follow the House bill that's currently being debated and make sure that we give you the best information we can about what it means and what we're required to do, and then work with our team to figure out what options we have, that maybe go above and beyond that.
Can I just add something, Terry?
Mm-hmm.
Just that as it's defined in House Bill 2001, a quadplex is 4 units, or a fourplex is 4 units on a single lot. So or a triplex is 3 units on a single lot. And that's defined as part of the House bill. So as it's defined through the HB 2001 legislation, separate units on separate lots wouldn't fit those definitions. So that's just something to keep in mind now, is that that's not part of the flexibility that you're talking about, isn't built into House Bill 2001 for those housing types. But that'll probably have to change pursuant to this new legislation.
Yeah. And we have a small army of folks tracking our definitions in the land use code, because we need to make sure all our I's are dotted and T's are crossed as we go forward.
So Terry, I'm sorry, can I ask you one more question in terms of this next House bill and allowing more flexibility to the city of Eugene? And that's really why I'm kind of focused on this, and it might be too late. I would love to encourage more flexibility, just as Dylan suggested, and kind of expand House Bill 2001 for this flexibility. Did the city of Eugene take a position on that?
I don't recall. Alyssa might.
So you're talking about the Senate bill that just passed. We took a neutral position on that particular bill. We did work with them to help get the language to a place that would be implementable.
Okay, so you've got, I think we got through a yes vote from Commissioner Taylor on this particular question. That's 3 down, 10 to go. This is good. Your questions and comments are helping the team as we prepare for the next step. So thank you. You've seen this before, the questions about lot and development standards, general. Again, the project team recommendation lands between encourage and incentivize. And the shorthand description is that we meet or exceed minimum standards for height, setbacks, and parking, and incentivize near transit. Given our earlier conversation, there might be some questions about this, but I'll go ahead and ask for your Commissioner Boraski.
I would be a yes, with a caveat that I would like to know when and how we will be able to delve into those. You know, when is it once the code's written, then we're going to give you input on what we'd like to see as far as parking standards, or are you looking for that at today's meeting? Same thing with setbacks and heights and those types of things. Where in the process do you want us to give specific input on those types of things?
Great. So in the memo, and Kate and Matt jump on in, there are specific recommendations. They're not written as code language yet. We'll go over that in June, but there are recommendations for number of parking spaces, numbers for height, numbers for setbacks. And I would just point out in regards to closeness to transit that we heard a lot of public input for equitably distributing middle housing opportunity around the city, equitably distributing as much middle housing, or all the types of middle housing, I should say, around the city. And we heard a lot of support for doing more and allowing even more near transit. So I just wanted to get that across because I thought it was fascinating and interesting and worth considering what Sarah Adam Shane was bringing up about perpetuating exclusion and segregation. I think that's something we need to be really careful about as we continue to do this work, but probably can't come to a resolution at today's meeting.
I would just add, so this is a really general question, and the rest of the questions that we're going to ask you in the straw polls ask a similar question to this about each specific housing type. And when we pose those questions, we can tell you, for these types of standards, we are recommending incentivize, and for these types of standards, we are recommending encourage. So this question is just asking it in like the most general way we can, almost, for this set of standards, lot and development standards. Just very, very generally, do you support this approach? And I think we've heard in previous meetings that you generally do, depends on the specifics, of course, and we will talk about those.
Well, yeah, again, getting back to my question is, we've gotten more information since these memos that we're referring to. You know, we have the stakeholders group that presented to us today that specifically gave us good recommendations about parking that aren't necessarily in the memo that you guys are going to be writing the code from. So where do we give you the input on, yes, I liked what the stakeholder group, the developer stakeholder group had to say about parking? You know, where and how do we get that input in there? Because that's not necessarily in the memo that we're referring to from the 26th meeting.
Yeah, that's a good question. We knew that we were planning the developer focus groups in particular to ask them questions about several of the things in the memo. And I guess I would invite Matt and Kate to comment on this, but in general, I found the developer focus group discussion to agree with most of the recommendations, and where there are differences, you're hitting right on it. I think they would take parking further and incentivize that further than some of the other groups, and lot coverage is the other one. When we get to design standards, we can discuss that one as well, but I think there are trade-offs, and we heard different things from the developer focus group than we heard from Healthy Democracy and the Equity Roundtable with specific regard to those two, lot coverage and parking.
So I will say yes with a maybe.
Yes with a maybe?
Well, I want to be able to make sure that those, I'm able to express those things into the code. And I don't know where that's going to be. So if it's in this, if it's in number 4, the overall general, then I want to make sure it's in there. If it's going to be someplace else that's more specific, I can say yes. But at this point, not seeing the rest of it, I'll say maybe.
Okay, Commissioner Beeson?
Well, I'm going to make a couple of comments. My answer is yes. I guess I want to tell you, I went through this stuff in detail. I went back through the 426 material, and I'm pretty much on board with the staff recommendations down through here. I will say my thinking on this has been evolving pretty rapidly. We've gone from the general to the specific, and we keep doing that, and that's very good. I'm expecting, I guess, along with what Commissioner Borowski's saying, we're going to have additional chance to weigh in on this when we start seeing the code amendments and talk about it in more detail. Having said that, I'm ready to go with the recommendations. After I read everything from the developer group, and as I've listened to the various speakers and thought about this, I'm finding myself thinking we can encourage and incentivize to a greater degree than we are in this material. I don't know that everybody's ready to take a bigger bite of the apple. I understand we're making recommendations. We're not making decisions. We're going to forward this to the city council. But I find myself thinking, the idea of allowing smaller lot sizes, the idea of allowing a little bit more height on the duplexes in wider areas than just transit, the maximum lot coverage, and I could keep kind of going on, but I find myself going more that direction. So I guess I just want to communicate that. I want to, understand what everyone else is looking at and saying too, but I just find myself thinking we can, as we look at this and proceed, we could go a bit further in terms of flexibility and how we implement middle housing in Eugene. So yes, is my answer.
Then we could qualify your yes with more towards incentivized, because that's what I'm hearing you say.
Absolutely, and I'll try not to repeat that every step of the way, but as we go down the page, I find myself looking at those, and where I see the word allow down there, I'm thinking, yeah, I may agree with you, but anyway, I'd like to counsel, or I'd like to just support the idea of us going further wherever we could as a group.
Understood.
Okay.
Commissioner Edwards.
My answer is a yes, but I want to just say one thing quickly. I'm not convinced that the incentives of being proximity to transit is the only thing that I want to pursue. And so in light of today's conversation, but also an understanding of how transit is funded and planned and all of those things, it's very much tied to opportunities for minoritized populations. I think it's really complicated, but I also want to see middle housing spread throughout our community. So I'm kind of struggling with that, but I want to kind of try to right size what those incentives should be. And if it's not just exclusive to being in close proximity to transit, I want to reserve that right to look at other options. So I'm a yes, but just want to put that out there.
Got it. Thank you. Commissioner Fragola.
So I am struggling a little bit to find where we are in the document. So are we looking at the questions with the red text?
No, we are going through the 13 items that are on your attachment D, I believe it is, which is a straw poll form. And then there's a little bit of cross tabbing and referencing that has to be done between that kind of shorthand cheat sheet and the packet from April 26th.
So where in April 26th would I be looking for this?
Page 8, Lot and Development Standards General.
And is it page 8 that's numbered for the PDF or page 8 that's numbered on the page?
On the overall packet, so the PDF.
Okay, because when I look there are questions, bold questions with red type.
This is basically question 2 on that page.
Okay, thank you. That's what I'm asking. All right. So I guess what I'm noticing here is that what's being recommended is the allow approach, which would keep existing standards for middle housing. And so I think I don't know if I agree with the allow for some things like setbacks and for height. And so I'm going to fall in with Commissioner Beeson in that I'm more strongly in the encourage incentivize. So when we get to these things where it's the allow, particularly for some of the areas that are going to be barriers to making it for the housing to be built, I'm going to want us to push beyond that.
Great.
So I'm a maybe here.
A maybe and a lean towards incentivize.
Yeah. So yes, I support the encourage incentivize recommendation for these things, but I see in the description for 2, it says allow for these specific things. So that's where I would not be supportive. I want to go farther.
Okay. Thank you. Commissioner Isaacson.
I'm also with Commissioner Fregola and Commissioner Beeson on maybe with leaning toward incentivize.
Great. Commissioner Rainey.
So I'm a maybe. So first of all, this says incentivize near transit. Should that really say incentivize near transit corridors?
Yes, frequent transit routes is
frequent
actually
transit routes. Okay, because by definition, if we could afford transit correctly, as Commissioner Edwards pointed out, it would be fully dispersed within the community, and therefore we would be meeting our dispersal goals if we were putting housing. If transit was working right, it would be dispersed within the community so that you could get it everywhere. You could walk to a bus stop, and a bus stop rather than a transit corridor. I think that's the distinction I'm trying to make. Those are 2 different things. So having said that, then depending on what we're incentivizing, if we're reducing the number of parking spaces because people are near transit, that makes sense to me, but I'm not sure how some of the other incentives really fall into that category. So it's almost like that has to be related somehow to the idea that you don't need your car, and therefore you can use transit. So
Matt, do you think we should answer those questions on the subsequent slides when we're talking about individual housing types?
Yes, that is what I would recommend, because we do, again, we ask these questions more specific to individual housing types, and we provide more information in the memo and the table. We can also talk about what we heard from different groups. Yeah, I would suggest, again, this was just sort of a like, take the pulse kind of question. You know, are we generally headed in the right direction? Recognizing we will talk about these individual standards as we move through these other questions. So that's my suggestion. Yes, I would agree.
Okay. So I think this is a good discussion. And what my takeaway is it's complicated. It's a maybe to a yes. And also, I also hear you leaning more towards incentivizing, but wanting to know more about that and what the transit relationship.
Commissioner Borowski's got his hand up here too, I see.
Okay. You're on mute.
I guess I just had a question to help clarify. I'll come back to it.
Commissioner Taylor.
I feel similarly to Commissioner Borowski in terms of I'd like to see some of our information, some of the details reflect feedback from the various groups and those nuances. And I also agree with Commissioner Fragola and Commissioner Beeson. So I'm really a maybe because I think that incentive should expand farther, deeper into neighborhoods.
Okay. All right, that was a good warm up. Commissioner Borowski?
Thank you. Sorry, I have a thing going on at my business that I'm struggling with. But so Commissioner Fragola, in the number 2 up there, the only one that they were saying was allowing was in reference to minimum setbacks. So right now, the minimum setback, I think, is 5 feet. So were you thinking that you wanted to encourage it by going less than 5 feet? The other ones were height and density and those types of things, but the minimum setback was the only one that was at allow. And for me, we just got done going through a work session on setbacks and what people felt was appropriate with commercial and those types of things. So I just wanted to have a clarification on it.
Are you asking me to clarify?
Well, I mean, that was the only part of it that was allowed. So you
okay,
you would like to see it.
I appreciate the clarification coming from you. I'm just seeing it all grouped here. And so what I was saying is that if we're looking at this grouping here and it says meet or exceed, I'm specifically giving that feedback, but I'm also hearing that we're going to get down to giving feedback specifically. And in response to your question, I would not want to see less than a 5-foot setback. You know, based on the fact that, but I would want to be able to have a conversation about more specifics, but thanks for the clarification.
Okay. So the specifics you all have been craving are here. And these next couple of slides go through each housing type and kind of still we're having to summarize because there are a lot of code standards that relate to each type. But maybe I'll just ask Matt to offer some thoughts on duplexes.
I am going to talk about a number of those specific standards because I think we need to be able to hear from you. So this is really kind of in the recommendations, we've got a mix of allow, encourage, and incentivize. And I'll tell you what we say about specific standards in each regard. So there's actually 2 where we talk about allow. One, as Commissioner Borowski just said, was setbacks. Current setbacks in the R1 to R4 zones are 10-foot front yard setback, 5 feet interior. And that's what we're recommending is the allow. Rather than going below 10 feet in front or 5 feet on the sides or rear, we're recommending sticking with that. The only other one where we recommended allow was maximum lot coverage, and we intend to talk about that separately. So we're gonna kind of, I would say, set that one aside because we have a specific question about lot coverage. In every other place, we recommend allow or encourage or incentivize. And I'm going to note the things where we say incentivize, and then the other things are going to be essentially encouraged. So, and this slide sort of does it a little bit. It notes that incentivize near transit with a lot size. So we're recommending allowing smaller lot sizes everywhere than what the OAR requires you to allow, but even smaller lot sizes near transit. So that's for lot size. Height is another one where the recommendation is incentivize, and it's right now your R3 and R4 zones have pretty tall height requirements. So we're really just talking about R1 here. So the current recommendation is to increase the allowable height in the R1 zone for duplexes to 35 feet near transit, keep it at 30 feet elsewhere. So that's an incentivized recommendation. If we wanted to incentivize further, we could bump it up to 35 everywhere. But that wasn't the initial recommendation. And then the other one where we're suggesting incentivize is related to parking. And so we are recommending no off-street parking spaces required in proximity to transit. Elsewhere, 1 space per unit, and everywhere you could get an on-street parking credit for the off-street space, assuming that on-street parking is allowed and feasible in those areas. In all other standards, so that includes lot width, lot width, alley lots, minimum open space. And yeah, in each of those cases, we're recommending the encourage option, which is basically going above and beyond the allow option, but not going sort of an extra step above and beyond it, including in transit areas near transit. So I think that's the level of detail y'all are looking for. This is all coming from the table in the memo that Terry's been referring to. But that's what that little shorthand description summarizes everything I just said. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's at least some of the details that I think you were asking about.
It's super helpful, and there's never a great time to take a break, but we're 10 minutes over when we were going to take a break. And I think we should do that. If you all indulge a 5-minute break, we'll come back and talk about duplexes, answer your questions, and take the straw poll. Okay. 5 minutes. We'll come back at 1:46. Thanks, Matt.
Sure. Do you
Commissioner Taylor.
Okay, my answer is actually nuanced, similar to last time. Is I think I'd probably so you know where I go to is I love Sarah's question because it's really I'm definitely a why person, so I have to start there. And it's, is there a public good, and what are the elements that people love in housing? I think that those elements can be achieved both in single family as well as multifamily. And I think they should be. We shouldn't differentiate. We're all people living in different housing types. So I would like to, so basically I'm going to always land in incentivize, encourage and incentivize. And I do want to break this mold of single family housing. So like anyway, so setbacks, I think in order to have an element of perceived compatibility, and I think the 5 and 10 is okay. I do agree with what Dylan said, a front yard setback. I'm not sure it always has to be a straight 10. So you might see me in the future kind of question that front yard setback depending on kind of the type. So, and once again, I'm not looking at duplexes different than the others. I actually think I look at them kind of ubiquitously. It's like it's just a different housing type. So there's that caveat. I think so. Side yards, 5's great, 10 feet. They're all building code regulations where there's going to be cost implications if you get closer to the setback beyond the 10. So it's going to cost. It's going to bring cost to the development, which I think I'd like to leave to the developers. So that's kind of a maybe. How about that? The 5, sure. 10 front yard, maybe. Your next one is height. Once again, I would do 35 feet throughout. I wouldn't just have it next to transit corridors because I think middle housing should be allowed throughout the entire neighborhood. And I think the special development standards, once again, they should not apply to middle housing. So I'm just giving you kind of, and it's based on really what we heard from all the speakers today. Parking. So hopefully I'm not skipping anything. Parking, I definitely agree. You're next to a transit corridor. It's great, although I don't want to perpetuate basically environmental justice issues. So some of the reason why we have, I think it's more complex. I mean, Commissioner Edwards talked about this. I would like to see LTD provide more. We need users. So if we just if we concentrate on corridor and incentivize around a corridor, guess what's going to happen? We're perpetuating this single family residential neighborhood being a certain housing type that doesn't necessarily have the same options. And I would like to see that looked at a little bit more. So parking, I'm definitely incentivize during transit. I'd like to probably encourage incentivize parking within the neighborhoods as well. So, and I think that's going to need to, we want to take a little bit, pay attention to what that looks like when it gets to code language. Hopefully that answered all of those parts.
Thank you. I think so. And we'll move on to Commissioner Rainey.
Okay, so I've lost as usual here, sorry. So I'm on the 26th package, the package we got on January, February, March, April 26th. And I'm looking at page 10, because I think that's what the note says. And it's a blue, some blue text. It says duplex and...
Yeah, Commissioner Rainey, what I tried to verbally summarize very quickly was everything on pages 10 to 13 in that document.
10 through 13?
Yep, because it goes beyond 10.
Yeah. And so all of these, so 10 through 13, that's 4 pages of stuff. And that's all related to duplexes, right? Okay. Wow. And we're here until when? Okay. So, but can the question be more general, incentivized? Yeah, I mean, I like the general approach. I'm still on the fence about the transit issue for all the, I forgot to articulate My last reason was about these transit corridors. The answer was yes. I got on this tangent about if transit was dispersed, then what's the big deal? But I'm thinking now about this being a different kind of housing. And I know we're not supposed to differentiate housing, but transit corridors are really probably for higher density housing than what we're talking about here. And if we want to disperse these throughout the city, and we're incentivizing them only on transit corridors, and we're not going to succeed in dispersing them as clearly as we could if we incentivized them everywhere. So having said all that, I'm okay with what we have here. And I think the 5 foot front yard is fine for me. I don't know if that's what we're suggesting. I think the parking suggestions are fine. So yeah, I think that's a yes for me on this one.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Isaacson.
Can I quickly jump in? Sorry, I didn't go through every single one. I went through the specific ones and I wrote down what Matt had, but he was just talking about specific examples. I would actually like to, I'll just say incentivize all. That's my perspective. Because I don't really, the lot coverage, I definitely have an issue with that. So anyways, I would say my vote is incentivize.
So I want to ask you a real specific question related to that.
Yes.
Would that mean that you would say don't require any parking for duplexes anywhere?
That's where, I mean, my prior response is actually the more nuanced response. So you can still keep that, but I was thinking if we're staying general, but I'm hearing you want more specifics. So I can just go through, I like the way, I can just go through density. Yes, I agree on the blue form in 10, maximum height. I would like to go to 35 feet throughout. Maximum setbacks, I would do encourage and incentivize are the same. That would be my preference. Lot coverage would be incentivize, and that means there'd be further allowance near transit above what's being, that's my understanding. So above even what's being presented here. In fact, I would actually look even closer at lot coverage and maybe eliminate it, because lot coverage is often, it's got other regulatory factors. So I'm not sure I really.
And again, we ask about lot coverage separately, so I'm going to suggest everybody just.
Okay, great. That's why I wasn't clear, so thank you. And minimum open space, that's separate too, so don't go through all the green. Is that right, Matt?
Oh, no, that's fine. We have a very specific question on lot coverage. That's what I'm just.
Perfect. Okay, got it. Open space, I would say that I'm in the encourage, incentivize. Parking, that's a little nuanced. I think I would probably be in the encourage, incentivize. I do think the market tends to actually regulate that, with the exception of what I would, it's a fascinating dynamic, because if you provide parking on the site, so let's take a look at rentals, then you can also get rentals if you make parking so scarce. I mean, we're not there yet, but then you've got a situation that parking becomes really expensive. And it's not only, I mean, then you've got rent increases just for a parking space, and you've got to have transit. Anyways, it gets complicated fast. We're not there. We're not San Francisco yet. So I would like to actually push us away from really where Dylan was talking about it, some of the other speakers on the panels, and also Sandra talked about it, and really looking at what the parking does to impact housing. And I think our community has too much attachment to on-street parking. So I like the idea of kind of looking at on-street parking as an option to meet standards. On-street parking in front of your house is not your personal parking. And I would like, once again, more opportunity, more housing. So there, hopefully that answered it.
Commissioner Rainey, did you finish?
Well, in that, thank you, Commissioner Taylor. In that time, I had time to look at this even more closely and recognize that where it says recommended approach, I think I'm in concert with all of those, including the parking. So I think I'm good to go. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Isaacson.
Yes.
Beautiful. Commissioner Fragola.
Okay, thank you. So I'm a general yes in the encourage and incentivize category, which is, I think, what this broad statement is asking us to look at. Going back to the minimum setbacks, I would be okay with the front yard 5 feet as well in terms of pushing it more to an encourage, because we are currently in the recommend. And so also with the height, I would go the same way with putting the 35 feet throughout, not just near the transit zone and the transit corridor. And I think that those are the only two that I have. Oh, and then the parking. Yeah, I think I would go more to the incentivize with the parking. I see that the way this one has it is half spaces near the transit corridor, 1 space per unit elsewhere, and allow on-street parking credit everywhere. So the allowing on-street parking credit everywhere, does that mean outside? I mean, everywhere, transit corridor, whatever, just everywhere.
Yeah, everywhere that there is on-street parking. You know.
Okay, yeah. Great. So I'm down with that. Thank you. Yes.
Great. And I'll do a check-in, a process check-in when we're done calling all the commissioners on this one. Commissioner Edwards.
So I'm also, I mean, obviously I'm in general, I'm a yes, but I think that this is a really important component that I feel like I need to interject into in these conversations, because we're talking about this incentivizing near transit, and we're talking about established frequent transit routes, and those exist as is. The thing that I think is important to understand is that transit doesn't operate in a if you build it they will come kind of scenario. Like, we've actually seen that like not work at all in areas like where I live at the end of Delta Highway. It's not an option to put transit out there. And so I think that it's important to know how it works and how it, transit operates with finite resources. And so they have to serve the most people that they can by consolidating resources. And so keeping the riders in an area where they can be served is really important. So putting middle housing that is very, where the and then, not having parking and all of those things, expecting that those folks can take transit or ride bikes or whatever else. We have other things that we have to think about. I like the idea of incentivizing, but I'm really torn. I've explained why. I think that it also does perpetuate the environmental injustice issue. But incentivizing by removing parking requirements in areas that will never be served by transit is actually a challenge for me, because I don't think that serves the community as well as saying, well, we already know that the folks that would be living in this general area, a quarter of a mile from these roadways, have more options. And it might not just be transit, it could be bike paths, and it could be other things like that. So I certainly support the incentives, but what I'm saying is, like, I actually, I do think that it needs to be a little bit more strategic, and that piece of the equation is kind of relevant. And so I don't want us to go down a path saying, like, we should really be incentivizing it everywhere, all over community, because we want it everywhere. I agree with that, but I don't want to make those types of trade-offs that suddenly we, parking is one thing, height and lot sizes and those other things, to me, can be treated differently. So for me, it's a parking issue. Like, I actually want to be able to maintain the parking, but minimal parking if it's not near any accessible transit. So sorry, I know that was kind of a a long answer, but my answer to this question is my poll, it would be yes.
Thank you. And again, yeah, we'll kind of talk some process at the end of this one. Commissioner Beeson.
I'm yes, and I'm leaning towards incentivize all the way through. I agree with Commissioner Taylor. I agree with most everything I've heard, I think. So we're doing duplexes. Just a couple of, just to, I guess, reaffirm, I definitely like the idea of moving incentivize out away from what we're designating as the transit routes in several of these standards, and particularly like building height. I recognize we're going to talk about lot coverage in a minute. I think I'm okay with the way that you guys have setbacks at this point. Just a bit about parking. I'm listening pretty carefully to Commissioner Edwards. I don't disagree. I guess I definitely find myself, what I was reading about duplexes is that within the transit corridors, we're at 0 per unit. 0 spaces is the way I'm reading it. And I think that I'm assuming as you bring the amendments forward, we're going to get another look at this. I keep saying that because I want very much to do that. And I think we have to have more conversation about it. I'm really kind of for duplexes wanting to really think about whether we want to do the incentivize all the way out into the community with the 0 spaces per unit. So I'm at yes and leaning to incentivize.
Thank you. Commissioner Borowski.
Thank you. Yes, for me, on as far as incentivizing, when it talks about height and lot size, I would like to remove the near transit. I think I think we should be removing near transit on almost all of these. The only one where I would say it might take a deeper dive is when it's coming to parking, because parking, I think, needs a little bit more further thing. I don't know if I'm ready to go to 0 parking throughout the whole community, but I would be open to that discussion. As far as lot sizes, I think we heard from the development group that lot sizes should be able to go down smaller. And so that, for me, right now it's incentivized just near transit. Again, I would go citywide on that. As far as setbacks, for me, I would be okay with a 5-foot setback on a smaller lot size. But if we're on larger lot sizes, maybe go to the 10-foot front setback on a larger one. But I'm not married to that. So that's where I'm at on those. I think after the discussions we had earlier today, I think that the transit corridor shouldn't be our measuring stick for a lot of these incentivizations. I think that we should try and do them as much citywide.
Thank you. I saw a lot of head nods there, so I want to circle back to that in a minute and ask the whole commission if they feel the same as what you just said. They're even nodding right now. Maybe I'll just ask you right now for an additional straw poll. Generally, what I heard you say was you want to follow the incentivized path citywide, not just near transit, except maybe where parking is concerned. Is that what I said? Is that what you said?
And we're specifically talking about duplexes.
Well, we are, and we will talk about the rest of them. But I just wanted to make sure, since I saw a lot of nodding, that I recorded it. So for duplexes, yeah. Okay. So I have a suggestion, maybe not an answer, but we have 23 minutes left in this meeting. We wanted to try to talk about your letter to council before the end of the meeting. And we could do that probably quickly at the end, so that if you had a chance to read it and can discuss delegating a job to the chair to finishing the letter. I think that could be done quickly. But for the rest of the items, I think we're going to encounter a lot of the same discussion on every housing type. And so I'm wondering if we might be able to lean on Matt a little bit to help us understand where there's differences as we go through these next couple that talk about the other housing types, so that we can get to lot coverage, special area zones, design stand, you know, we've got some meaty ones left. And although we are coming back in June, we're trying to get your quick hit or your direction at this meeting so that we bring you the best possible product at the 2 meetings in June. So it's always a challenge to make good use of our time, but I guess that's my one suggestion, is that we try to be efficient with the issues that are likely to come up on every housing type and try to hone in on what's different about that housing type in the recommendations. Does that make sense? Okay. So what's different about triplexes and fourplexes, Matt?
Okay, so a lot of the things I said about duplexes are essentially the same. So just quick step back. I'm summarizing from pages 23 to 26 of the memo, or the packet, excuse me. But those sections of the memo, that's where the triplex and quadplex standards are. So most of what I said a moment ago about the recommendations related to duplexes are pretty similar when it comes to triplexes and quadplexes. What's different is that the one other thing we had in kind of the allow category was lot width or frontage. So currently the minimum lot width standards are 50 feet in the R1 zone and 35 feet in the R2 through 4 zones. Given the lot sizes we were generally recommending, we recommended keeping those, not changing those. So that's a difference in terms of the recommendations related to triplexes and quadplexes. We didn't recommend encourage or incentivize in that regard. In terms of lot area, obviously the lot area recommendations themselves are different, but the approach we recommended was the same, which was the incentivize, which was reduce them below what the minimum compliance, the OARs would allow everywhere, but reduce them even further in areas near transit. You know, what you said about duplexes in general was, no, just do that everywhere. So you might say the same thing about tris and quads, I don't know. And then the other thing that's different, again, setting lot coverage aside, would be parking, just in terms of the number of spaces that are recommended under the incentive approach. But it's actually pretty similar. It would be near transit, 0 spaces. Elsewhere, it would be essentially, it varies by the size of the lot. So it's fewer spaces required for smaller lots, essentially. And the most you'd require would be 3 spaces for a 4-plex on certain size lots. And you'd allow the on-street credit on-street parking credit everywhere. So those are the things that are different. The other things I talked about, or that we talked about before, pretty much the same in terms of height and the other items. And again, apologies for trying to do a lot in a short period of time.
We're just refining as we go. Let's start with you this time, Commissioner Borowski. Go for it. You're muted.
So the only things that I would maybe change is you talked about lot width. Right now we're looking at 50 foot for R1 and R2 35. We did hear from the development community about maybe a skinny long lot that would allow a triplex, you know, as long as the front doors didn't have to face the front. You know, that's design standards that we'll get into. So I would maybe want to go with maybe the 35, the same that's in R2 and R4 for that. And then same thing as far as minimum lot areas. we've got it broken out down into, you know, near transit and away from transit areas. I would go the same things as what is proposed for near transit citywide.
Thank you. Commissioner Beeson?
I think I'm pretty much in agreement with that. On lot coverage, I'd like to see us at least consider increasing that allowance.
We'll get to coverage in just a minute. We have a specific lot coverage question.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay.
Okay, I thought we were okay. And lot width, I think, was mentioned. I agree with Commissioner Borofsky to shorten that up a bit. On the other things we were talking about in there, the building height and the other things for duplexes, I'm just in basically the same place. I'd like to see us move towards incentivize as we go out into the community. And I'm hearing several people say, I think we should just have some additional discussion on parking, but I'm open to incentivizing it further out too.
Great. Commissioner Edwards, anything different for tries and
nope, I'm echo, ditto. I'll just say ditto. And I'll be quiet.
Commissioner Fragola.
So I'm a yes for the encourage and incentivize in this category. With the idea for the lot area minimums, I'd like to see the incentivize citywide, not just near the transit corridors. So basically I'm concurring with Commissioner Borofsky. With deeper conversations on the parking. I mean, I feel like we're going to have that anyway, but as long as we're allowing the on-street parking credits everywhere, I think that flexibility is going to help a lot.
Thank you. Commissioner Isaacson.
I'm a yes. I'm also on the same boat in terms of parking. I think the more density we're talking here, the more conversation we're going to have on parking. So I'm curious as to when that's going to happen.
Commissioner Ramey.
Yes, I'm on the same vehicle around parking as well. We have a conversation letter, and I'm with Commissioner Borofsky. His suggested amendments, although I didn't hear the front yard. Was a front yard reduction in this package from 10 to 5, or could it be?
It could be in the
only thing.
Team recommendation was the 10 and 5, but I think what we heard from a number of folks was
5. 5 and 5 everywhere would be my suggested improvement.
Thank you. Commissioner Taylor.
Thank you. I think I want to get specific because I'm realizing I completely agree with Commissioner Borofsky, and I'm realizing based on others' responses, I'm not sure everybody's talking about the same thing. So I think it's a good summary. I would do it for duplexes is just remove the near transit and just apply the incentive encourage, with the exception, like I said, of parking, which I think needs a little bit more attention. So if I'll just go through the specifics, the height, I would recommend throughout. Minimum maximum setbacks 5 and 5, same as duplexes. Lot coverage we're doing separate. I would say I would go to the incentivize and encourage. When you go to lot area, I agree with the recommended approach, but it's not just for transit, it's for all lots. I actually have been the one, so I'm pretty consistent. You'll hear it. Flag lots. I actually am not sure I support staying with 6,000 square feet. I would like when we get to, I want to look at that closer. I understand what the argument was when Matt brought it. I do think to some degree, a lot of requirements actually force a lot size. So us unnecessarily having that lot size. So anyways, I'll re-look at that again. Lot width and frontage minimum. You know, once again, I want to look at it through this lens. I mean, we've just gotten a lot of public feedback, and I like the idea of looking at the Pro-Forma based evaluation of our code standards. I mean, we have this history. I mean, you heard Sandra's today, her history. So I feel to some degree this is quick, and we're relying on base standards that might already have embedded kind of exclusion, I mean, just embedded past. And I would love for us to think outside the box. So for me, that means looking at some of these assumptions and looking at them a little deeper. So overall, I am, yes, supportive, incentive, and encourage for all lots, not just near transit. And I would like to take a look at some of these others that are just in allowed, like the flag lots and the lot width frontage, but I don't have any additional comment on that.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for your detailed comments. So I'm just gonna flip through here. We have cottage and then row houses. Maybe what we can do, let's do cottages and then take a break or shift gears, talk about the letter. And I think we might have to pull you for another meeting. Alyssa, what's your reaction to that idea? She screamed, but is nodding. Okay.
We'll have to talk because we've had a hard time finding additional meeting times. So we will talk.
The things that are left are not nothing burgers. And so I am concerned that we give the commission enough time to give us direction on these, but we'll have to try to do it pretty quickly because our time is running out with our consultants, and our next scheduled meeting on this is not until June 14th when we were intending to bring you code. So we will talk more about that, but let's talk about cottage clusters and talk about the letter and get done what we can. Matt, anything you want to say about cottage clusters?
Yeah, cottage clusters, there's a lot of requirements. And so I guess that's the first thing I'm going to say. And I'll try to go through things as quickly as I can. So now I'm looking at the pages 14 to 18 of the packet. And I'll try to, again, kind of note where we've got similar versus different recommendations. For minimum setbacks, we had the same recommendation, the 10 and 5, so you may be wanting to move to 5 and 5 on that. Minimum open space, we recommending not having a minimum open space requirement because of the requirements for courtyards, setbacks, pathways. We don't think it's necessary, frankly. The OAR doesn't allow you to have a maximum lot coverage requirement, so that just doesn't even come into the equation on cottage clusters. In terms of our approach to minimum lot area, it was similar to what we recommended for triplexes and quadplexes in terms of, allowing even smaller lot areas near transit. So again, based on what I heard before, you might be leaning towards no, use that everywhere. Lot width and frontage, we had a similar recommendation to triplexes and quadplexes, 30, 50, and 35. So again, going by earlier comments, you might be heading towards no, allow something less. Off-street parking, we had tied that's different because we tied it to unit size. And for smaller units near transit, we recommended 0 spaces and a half a space average per unit for larger units near transit. But elsewhere, we recommended 1 unit or 1 space per unit for the larger units. So that was a difference with a focus on transit or what happens near transit. I'm not going to go through all of these site special development standards, but I will talk about a couple of them. Height, we recommended limiting to 25 feet or 2 stories. And footprints, we recommended just a straight 900 square foot per cottage, which is what the OAR says, but one of the options, which we didn't recommend, was to allow for another 200 feet for an attached garage. We did hear from the development group that, yeah, they like that option. which was the encourage option. And we also, for maximum floor area, the staff recommendation was to have a cap on the maximum floor area per cottage and an average, in an effort to keep the average size of those units down. And I think what we heard from the development roundtable was be more flexible, don't necessarily put that cap on those. What we heard, yeah, so that's my summary of cottage clusters. Again, there's a lot in there. And I didn't go into the design standards part of it because it's a separate topic or question.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Taylor, are you willing to go first?
Oh, sure. Sorry. This is like, it feels like, oh, anyways. Okay. Generally, I'm going to be consistent with both duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes. I would incentivize and encourage generally throughout, not focus just on transit corridors. Except for parking, I'd like to take a little bit closer look at that. So once again, you go to the setbacks, I do 5 and 5. I think I like once again, the incentivize, encourage. So yes, yes, yes on those. The lot width and minimum frontage. Once again, I want to look at that. I want to better understand it. So I might sit in the encourage, incentivize. Generally, I like the way the parking's going on this, but once again, I would like a chance to have a bigger discussion about that. Minimum building separation, the recommended improvements of it. I would separation. I think that could be more flexible. So I guess I'd go encourage, incentivize again. I am going to look through this. Sorry, my approach to it when I did my own notes was a little different than the way you're doing it. I'm just going to stay with incentivize and encourage throughout, not just transit.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Ramey.
Yes, it's a little bit like drinking from the fire hose here. So I think I'm in line with what we've talked about earlier. The 5 and 5 setbacks for sure. And this is the only instance where we talk about maximum unit sizes. And I wouldn't want them to get any bigger than this. This seems to be at the edge of what Eco Northwest was telling us was affordable, the 1,200. Is it 1,200 average or is it 1,400 average with the garages? So I certainly wouldn't want to get any bigger than that. So I think I'm good to go here.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Isaacson.
Yeah, I'm fine with the setbacks. Parking again for me is going to be key, especially as we get more and more density into smaller space. I'm curious on what we're going to be, when we're having that conversation as well. So I'm a yes.
Commissioner Fragola.
So I am a yes to the encourage, incentivize throughout rather than just near the transit. So following that trend, can support the 5 foot, 5 foot, want to have a deeper dive into the parking. And there was one note that I had written that we had asked, a couple of us had asked previously that I don't know if there is an answer to it or if I am asking for it to be taken into consideration, but how does this impact tiny houses? And so wanting to make sure that as we are writing this code, that I would hope it would decrease barriers to tiny houses and not begin to lump them into a new category that would create barriers.
Good question. Thank you. Commissioner Edwards.
I'm going to agree with my colleagues' support for that, but that for the incentive approach, with the exception of the parking, I think it just needs to be reviewed. That's it.
Great. Commissioner Beeson.
I think I'm agreeing down the line. I agree with Commissioner Taylor and Fraggle, and most, I guess what everybody said, it kind of follows the notes I took. I think what I would also say, this is maybe obvious, I think we need to work to find a time to have some additional discussion, and it would be good clearly on parking. And then there's a couple of others that have been mentioned, tiny houses and so on. And it would be good to have the pump primed a little bit on the parking discussion if the staff can do that. I mean, I just think there's a whole lot to that whole subject to talk about. The idea of minimizing parking out away from the transit areas, which I think is what we're going to have to get into.
Thank you. And Commissioner Borowski.
Yeah, I'm pretty much on board with the rest of the commission on this. However, this was one of the ones that had the most things to look at and the least amount of time to look at it. So I'm a little uncomfortable with that. And I do have a hard stop at 2:30. Just so you guys know, I'll be out of here in 2 minutes.
Okay. With that warning, I want to thank you for taking the time. We took notes and we've got the recording, and we will work hard to serve up some refined recommendations on a couple of these issues to you, and worked hard to try to find a meeting time. Thank you. Thank you. So I want to turn it over to Lisa, and she, along with Ken and Kristen, have been meeting as the PC resource group and have prepared a letter for you. So Lisa.
Oh, I didn't know I was nominated to do this, but I'll go for it. So can we stop sharing so I can see everybody?
Absolutely. I'm sorry.
And so I'm going to assume folks have had the opportunity to read the letter. Just looking for some. Commissioner Borowski? Yes. Okay, great. And so I would like to move that we,
I think you just voted for it.
Okay, great. I would like to move that we move to forward this letter with discretion to the chair. I think that was what Lauren was suggesting, right? That we can refer it to the chair, that we give the chair authorization to move forward with the letter, and that includes with perhaps making some fine-tuning edits.
Yes, the Planning Commission could authorize the chair. I think what I'm hearing you say is to sign the letter and to forward it to the City Council, and then also in the event that there are sort of kind of non-substantive fine-tuning changes, or you could authorize them to make substantive changes as well, but give Commissioner Ramey that specific authorization to kind of move forward, finalize the letter, and pass it on to City Council. You have that authority.
Okay, so that's what I so moved.
Second.
Discussion? Does anybody have any substantive changes to make to the letter? Okay, so I'm not seeing any. So I think we're pretty comfortable with it. Chris, are you feeling okay about it? Okay.
Yes, I just read it. It looks great.
Okay. So I think we're good.
Great. Thank you for doing that.
Do we need to vote on that?
Yeah, I think we probably should vote.
Okay.
And I'll
6-0. I got a 6-0 for the recorder.
Yeah, and I can check with Commissioner Borowski. I think he was trying to.
I think he was a yes. Yeah. And then I guess I'm just wondering, are we going to do the same thing as last time where Chris you'll present it? Okay, awesome. Thank you, Chris.
That would be my preference. If it can be, if it's a work session and I can be at the table, that's fine. If I'm public comment, I'll do that too. Whatever works best.
Okay, we'll follow up with you. Great. Okay, I know this was a really long meeting. Thank you all for hanging around. And over to Alyssa for any closing things. No?
I think since we're already over, I will just save mine, and I guess we'll be looking for some more meeting times.
Can I just ask, The SAZs, the only thing we didn't get to, or was there other stuff?
No, we didn't get to, let's see.
So
Row
obviously,
houses, row house density and lot size, lot coverage, design standards, special area zones, and affordability strategies. There's
Okay.
quite a bit left.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Got through over half, 7 out of 13 of our straw poll questions. So just to put a positive spin on it. Also,
you gave some pretty meaty direction to us. So I think you did a lot of hard work today. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks.
Hey, Terry, can I ask you? I just want to ask you a quick question. Terry, how do you envision tiny houses coming back to us? I'm just curious because that's one of my challenges with cottage clusters. I don't want to group them together because tiny houses can get much smaller in square footage. And I think that's what might end up happening. And I want to have more flexibility and not have them automatically kind of shoved into a cottage cluster type housing. So it's just a question for follow-up, but I have the same concern that Commissioner Fragola does.
That's great. Since it's been raised, we'll talk about it amongst
What about tree houses?
Perfect.
Parking's gonna drive it.
All right, thank you all again.
Thanks.